Excellent. It is 3 o'clock, and we are going to start this webinar. Thank you for attending, all of you out there. This webinar, Rethinking GRAS Status for Ultra-Processed Foods, hosted by Consumer Federation of America. I am Thomas Gremillion, Director of Food Policy at Consumer Federation of America, and I will be moderating the discussion over the next hour, relaying your questions periodically to our speakers. So bring the questions on in the chat. Don't wait until the last 5 minutes. We'll try to get to them periodically. If you enjoy this afternoon's programming, I encourage you to come to the National Food Policy Conference hosted by Consumer Federation of America each year in Washington, D.C. Our upcoming conference will take place March 3rd and 4th at the Marriott Metro Center Hotel here in D.C. And more information on that and on CFA's food policy advocacy and other advocacy is available on the Consumer Federation of America website. We've also provided a link to Commissioner Kessler's citizen petition to FDA, which we'll be discussing, and we encourage you to submit comments on that docket and contribute to this very important conversation around how we can turn the tide on diet-related disease that continues to cause so much suffering in this country and really across the world. So, without further ado, we are honored to have with us today two distinguished public servants, both renowned for taking bold action to protect consumers. I can't do justice to all of their accomplishments in the brief time we have today, but I'll offer a few highlights. David Aaron Kessler first served as FDA Commissioner from 1990 to 1997 under Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. Weren't those the times when an FDA commissioner could serve under two presidents in that manner. But he presided over rulemaking to require the Nutrition Facts Panel on foods and led the charge to regulate tobacco products at FDA, among many other accomplishments. And he later returned to public service to lead Operation Warp Speed under President Biden. And he's published several best-selling books on nutrition and food policy, including his latest, Diet, Drugs, and Dopamine, the New Science of Achieving a Healthy Weight. Joining David today is Mike Taylor, who is no stranger to controversy himself. Among food safety advocates, Mike's actions at USDA FSIS, as the USDA FSIS administrator to prohibit raw ground beef contaminated with E. coli 0157H7 is the stuff of legend. Mike later served as Deputy Commissioner for Foods at FDA from 2010 to 2016, where he, more than anyone else, was responsible for implementing the Food Safety Modernization Act at FDA, and during which time he revoked the GRAS status of trans fats, which we're going to be talking more about today. So, to get into the topic at hand, my first question is going to be for David. Just to set the stage for us, Commissioner Kessler, as a physician and former FDA commissioner, why have you chosen to focus on chronic disease and food?
Thanks for the question, Thomas, and thanks for hosting this to CFA. Only 12% of Americans are healthy, are metabolically healthy. When you just look at basic parameters of blood pressure, lipid profile, waist circumference, and glucose. In fact, over the weekend at the European Congress in Cardiology, the number that they used was 9%. 25% of us will go on to develop heart failure in our lives. 30 to 40% of us will develop diabetes. About half of us have pre-diabetes. 25% of us will have a stroke. And I think, medicine is waking up to the fact. And I think there is a convergence among cardiologists, nephrologists, endocrinologists, obesity medicine specialists, that it's the fat in places where it does not belong, right? It's not, the problem is not weight. That fat in places where it doesn't belong, it can go by certain names, call it ectopic fat, the visceral, it's that fat, in our midsection, that is responsible for cardiac, renal disease, diabetes, 13 forms of cancer, neurodegenerative disease, It's that fat, I mean, that accumulates in our abdomen, but it's the fat that gets into our liver, our pancreas, and our heart. And that fat where it doesn't belong, right, causes many of the chronic major cardiac, renal, metabolic diseases. We always knew that weight wasn't good for us, but we now know that that ectopic fat, that visceral adiposity, that fat where it doesn't belong, is causal in many of these chronic diseases. You know, back in the 1960s, you know, the major, the real culprit, you know, I mean, to much of that chronic disease was cigarettes, right? Atherosclerotic disease, certainly lung disease, other forms of cancer. Today, it is our diet. And the food we are eating is resulting in this toxic fat that is dramatically impacting not only our health, but what, you know, we call our health span. Those years, you know, we live about 19 years longer than we did 5 decades ago. But many of those years, our senior years, are spent in disability because of these chronic diseases. I mean, that's why this is so important.
Yeah. Really, yeah, the numbers are overwhelming. And as you alluded to, the food uh, is coming more and more under fire, and there's a real crisis of confidence among consumers. I think it's fair to say with the food supply and what's in it, and so that brings up a question of how FDA is and our other food safety agencies are overseeing the food supply. And Mike, I wanted to ask you about a quote you made when you were deputy FDA Commissioner in 2014. And you said, we simply do not have the information to vouch for the safety of many chemicals in the food supply. And that's a really astounding thing to hear from, a sitting official. How did we get here, and specifically, what role has the generally recognized as safe or GRAS designation played in oversight of the ultra processed foods that have come to dominate the kind of food environment?
Yeah, so thanks, Thomas. And again, join David in thanking you and CFA for doing this webinar on this really big topic. I made that observation back at a time when I was engaging on caffeine in various in energy drinks, but also began to proliferate in other foods. Amazing diversity of foods, from Cracker Jacks to all kinds of different, cakes and different uses, and all based upon independent determinations by the food producers that caffeine in those products was generally recognized as safe. And as everybody knows, that general recognition of safety within the legal framework of food additive regulation takes the use out from the formal pre-market approval of food additives that was the original central purpose of the food additive amendments when it was enacted in 1958. Back then, chemical technology was coming to the fore, reshaping the food supply in different ways, but parallel to what David's focusing on in his petition. And the industry actually advocated for a pre-market approval system. Congress incorporated this generally recognized as safe exemption from pre-market approval, really having in mind principally the practical reality that the food supply was full of ingredients, common ingredients. Salt and vinegar often used as examples, where over a long history of common use in food, scientists could agree, yeah, these aren't worth the trouble, essentially, to go through a formal pre-market approval process. So substances that are generally recognized as safe are exempt from food additive approval. That's a rigorous, the way that is actually defined by Congress and by FDA, that's a rigorous standard, because that requires for anything that was not coming into the market with a long history of use, anything post 1958, there had to be the same scientific evidence of safety and meeting the reasonable certainty of no harm safety standard that Congress adopted for food additives, plus that safety has to be generally recognized by qualified experts. So in and of itself, it's a rigorous, well, the standard, if implemented properly. And the reality is, and I won't go into the gory details, but there's just been a kind of a very dynamic, very gradual evolution in the way both FDA and the industry have managed under that GRAS, exemption from the food additive definition. FDA throughout the 70s and 80s was actually pretty active, wanting to affirm in a formal process the GRAS status of substances that didn't have that history of use, but were coming into the food supply as technology was evolving. And companies would submit evidence to FDA, and there'd be a rulemaking, and there are a whole bunch of GRAS affirmation regulations, many of which are the rules under which the materials that David's petition is addressing are included. On the other hand, the law also, and this is what I think is creating a lot of the reality that we live with today, it's a clear legal principle. Nobody disputes that under the law, companies are free to make independent GRAS determinations without ever reaching out to FDA. And so that's really where as FDA's attention waned, as we moved into the 90s, and companies were very impatient with a food additive approval process that actually has an extraordinarily cumbersome, I think, unduly legalistic process for getting a food additive petition approved. The industry sort of said, well, listen, we've got this flexibility, let's start using it. And so gradually we took this pre-market approval statute and turned it on its head, and it became an industry sort of run independent GRAS determination process that really turned the law largely into a post-market, in terms of FDA's kind of practical program, into a post-market program. But without ever the resourcing and there were some efforts over the years, and there's one going on now to try to do post-market review, but over the 90s, the 2000s, there's not been a systematic oversight program. And so you've got this GRAS concept sort of eating up the pre-market approval principle, and you now have products on the market that are either the subject of very old GRAS affirmation rules from the 70s and 80s by FDA, or independent GRAS determinations. And in neither case, is there the evidence that FDA or anybody else is aware of. I've made my observation, and sort of in the context of caffeine and its proliferation, and the fact that this independent GRAS avenue is sort of eating up the purpose of the Food Additives Amendment. But so here we are today with a system in which, again, the substances that David is focusing on from a health standpoint are in the market without the public having or FDA or anybody in a systematic way having the full understanding of the basis for judging these uses of these substances to meet the reasonable certainty of no harm safety standard. And that, whether you're talking about the food additive approval process or the GRAS process, the burden of proof on safety is on the companies, the folks that are using these materials. So yeah, so getting us, we got to where we are through this evolutionary process. There's no evil kind of secret plan. It was the evolution of practices, synergy between government and industry, that has us where we are. And again, as we get through the conversation, I hope we can talk about what a powerful tool the GRAS concept is, because of the nature of the standard and the burden of proof it imposes. It can be a powerful tool for bringing about change, but it's also what has led us to the situation we're in now, where it's hard to provide assurances to consumers of safety, because we just don't have the data in hand.
Yeah, and I mean, just to comment, I mean, the fact that FDA doesn't even receive notification necessarily of some of these GRAS determinations, I think really undermines consumer confidence, regardless of how important that is to the harms. I mean, the substances that are in the petition we're going to talk about are not, are well known and very much on the label. Before we go back to David, Mike, relate how did GRAS allow partially hydrogenated vegetable oils, trans fats, to come into food, and something that was estimated in 2006 to cause 1 in 5 heart attacks, 50,000 deaths a year. I mean, this is like truly poison. It was allowed to get in through this process, and why did it take so long to get trans fat out of food, even after the evidence of harm was so overwhelming?
Yeah, so I need to clarify a little bit sort of the sequence of events, and I don't deserve but so much credit for what we did, because it was sort of like cleaning up the last vestiges of trans fat. Yes, there was a long period of time going back to the 50s where evidence was emerging about hazards. I think it's fair to say that it was roughly in the 90s that a consensus formed that that trans fats, partially hydrogenated oils, were a risk factor for heart disease. And that started generating media and consumer pressure and attention. And FDA, to its credit, I was not there at the time. I think in a very clever, strategy. If I'm sure people in this audience recall, FDA required that the presence of trans fat and a quantitative declaration of trans fat be included in the nutrition facts panel. And the theory was that there was enough public concern and awareness because of the emerging evidence that would incentivize consumers to avoid products that had trans fat added to them, and companies would be incentivized to withdraw those uses. And that actually worked. I'm not recommending this as a model for transforming the food supply, because it's you can't require consumers to take responsibility for making their food safe. But that reduced by about 80%. By 2012, 80% of the added partially hydrogenated oils and trans fats associated with those oils had been reduced. That left 15 or 20%, and that's the piece that we addressed in the 2013 notice, which was simply a notice saying that the evidence the evidence that we've got shows there's a substantial question about the safety of trans fats, and there's no, and consequently there's if you look at the scientific community, there's no consensus that they're safe. It did not, and this is the important point, it did not require FDA to prove a causal link between trans fat and heart disease, because the burden of proof is continuing on the users of these substances, to the last day. And so again, that made it fairly easy, frankly, and for FDA to go ahead and do that analysis. And it did a thorough review of the literature and put in the Federal Register in 2013 that there was no general recognition of safety. There was a safety question, and got comment, and was able in a speedy time frame of less than 2 years, and in FDA time, was able to finalize that in 2015. But by then, again, the uses continued to come down, and so I don't know how much was actually still in the food supply when the 2015 rule, came down. But it was a demonstration of the two-edged sword aspect of the GRAS standard for industry, because you go out on your own with an independent GRAS determination, and FDA, all it has to do is issue a notice basically saying that no, you're not generally recognized as safe, and all of a sudden you've got an unlawful food additive in your product.
And that is kind of what makes your petition so interesting, David, is that you're taking advantage of this double-edged sword nature of the GRAS process to argue that processed refined carbohydrates similarly can no longer meet this safety standard, just as trans fats could no longer meet it. And maybe you could talk a little bit about the similarities you see there between trans fats and these processed refined carbohydrates.
So, I think we have the data today that ultra-processed foods are a primary culprit behind the epidemic of chronic disease and metabolic harm. I tend to refer to them not as ultra-processed, but ultra-formulated. That's a nuance because they've been engineered. They manipulate, the brain's reward system. I think the similarity is not just to trans fat, but also, in some ways they've become the new cigarette. I think similarly they've resulted in a health catastrophe. I mean, it's the perfect trifecta of fat, sugar, and salt. It's fat and sugar, fat and salt, fat, sugar, and salt. Just look around us. I mean, the proof is in our bodies. Today we are on average eating 500 calories more per person than 4 or 5 decades ago. So the central question is, why are people eating more than we did in the past? And I think the answer lies in a structural shift. I mean, there's been an industrial transformation of cheap crops into engineered food products. We put on every corner. We made available 24/7. We made socially acceptable to eat anytime. This shift created foods that are more calorie dense, sugar, fat, I mean, they took out the fiber. They took out anything that slowed down eating. They're less satiating. There's low fiber. They're acellular nutrients, and they're engineered for maximum, appeal. I mean, as you would expect, that leads to overconsumption. Back in the 1940s and 50s, the food industry learned to produce an entire palette of functional ingredients. I mean, it started with corn. These were the starch conversion products. I mean, it was chemistry. You started with corn, you got that starch, and then you were able to generate corn syrups, corn solids, maltose, dextrose, maltodextrin, and all those ingredients on the back of the ingredient panel that we've come not to understand. And this processing, this corn processing, turned a single crop into some ways a Swiss Army knife of food technology, right? I mean, once these ingredients existed, food manufacturers gained the power to create almost a whole separate universe of food products. And these are the middle islands from those basic, those ingredients. They were able to design texture, palatability, flavor, mouthfeel with scientific precision. And the result is what you might call the industrialization, an industrial formulation of the food matrix, a system where foods are no longer bound by natural constraints, but instead engineered for maximum appeal. So they're high reward, they're high appeal, there's low satiety. I mean, go think about it. I mean, in the most extreme, we have these ultra-processed foods that go down in a whoosh that are rapidly digested, and you can go out and spend $1,000 a month. If you don't want the ultra-processed foods, you go out, get a GLP-1, and then you can slow down your digestion. I mean, it is the most ironic of situations. But here's the problem. No one asked. During that industrial transformation, where we took out the fiber, we took out the natural ingredients that slowed down digestion, no one asked, what was the biological consequences? What were the metabolic consequences of this industrial formulation?
Yeah, yeah, and I want, I know we'll talk more about that, but I want to back up a little bit now, and to comment. Essentially, these processed refined carbohydrates, as I'm listening to you, in a way, they pose more of a challenge than trans fats because people didn't have this affinity for trans fats the way they probably we would all be loath to leave behind our donuts and Lucky Charms and whatnot. And in that sense, it is more like an addictive substance like cigarettes. But I think it'd be helpful for the audience to maybe back up at this point and have you walk us through what it is you've asked the administration to do in your petition, David, and kind of how it fits in with what RFK Jr. has been calling for.
So the petition actually bypasses the need to come up with a definition of ultra-processed foods. I mean, Mike can explain, but the Food and Drug Act deals with substances, it deals with ingredients. It does deal with those ingredients under conditions of use, right? So the petition calls on the administration to remove processed refined carbohydrates. So very specific ingredients from the food supply on the basis that they should no longer be considered generally recognized as safe or GRAS. It's been 4 decades since FDA reviewed the scientific basis of the GRAS status. I mean, go back and you can read the GRAS affirmation in 1988 in the Federal Register. but it's been 4 decades since FDA reviewed that scientific basis of these processed refined carbohydrates. These are corn syrups, corn solids. I'm not talking about things that are found in the home, right? This is not about sugar, flour, starch, but it's these processed refined carbohydrates for which there was, that 88 document. And during those 4 decades, it's no coincidence that the American obesity crisis has emerged. FDA's past GRAS determinations are based, when you go read that 88 affirmation, they are based on outdated data that did not properly assess the biological effects of those processed refined carbohydrates. The 88 GRAS affirmation said there was no link between these refined sweeteners, right? And there was no link between those sweeteners. They called them nutritive saccharides, right? The corn syrups and corn solids, and either obesity or cardiovascular disease and diabetes. So that's what's on the record in 1988. No link. Go look at the dietary guidance advice from 2015, 2020, and there you see all the science that actually links these processed refined carbohydrates with obesity, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes. Simply put, there is no expert consensus that refined carbohydrates in ultra-processed foods are safe under the present conditions of use. That, in my opinion, leaves FDA with no choice but to determine that processed refined carbohydrates, as a matter of science and law, can no longer be considered GRAS and must be removed from commerce. The petition demonstrates the continued GRAS status. I mean, I don't think it's legal, nor is it credible. I used to think, Thomas, and Mike can comment, he alluded to this, I used to think of GRAS as a loophole, but it's a very powerful tool. I mean, the food additive standard is reasonable certainty of no harm. GRAS substances, there has to be general recognition of safety. It has to meet the same standard. That burden, is not, the burden, it's very important, is not on the FDA to show it's unsafe. Just that there's no consensus, the burden is on the industry. I mean, to show it is safe. And I don't think that burden has been met, certainly in 2025. And the important thing is, just because you got on the market in 1970s and 1980s as GRAS, there is a continuing responsibility, right? And Mike can comment on this, to be GRAS throughout, right? Just because you're GRAS at one point in time doesn't relieve you of the ability to continue to be GRAS as the decades evolved.
Yeah. And I want to dig in a little bit on the foods that are the target of your petition and the different classes of ingredients. But I have a note here at this point to go to an audience question, and we may be having technical issues or something, but we're gonna work on that. And audience members, try to send us your questions if you can, or maybe email Anna Marie if something's going on there. But anyway, to move along, I just to unpack what you've asked for in this petition a little bit, David, and how it relates to ultra processed foods, which I think are more and more in the zeitgeist and of concern to consumers. Get the Carlos Montero and the architects of the NOVA classification system have said, look at the ingredients. That's the way to see if what you're eating is an ultra processed food. Your petition targets 3 groups of ultra processed foods: those that contain starch conversion products like maltodextrin or certain sweeteners like corn syrup, those that contain sugars or refined starches used with emulsifiers, and then those subjected to food extrusion technology. And that group, it's actually the second group in the petition, but I listed it last because I want to focus on that on that group of foods with refined flours and starches subject to food extrusion technology in particular, because those aren't necessarily identifiable as ultra processed foods when you look at the ingredients list.
Right.
And so I wanted to home in on that group a little bit and ask you, why bother focusing on these foods that might have, just lists seemingly wholesome ingredients. And what does it say about the current labeling rules that consumers can't distinguish these foods from other less processed foods?
So let me back up for a second, because I think the petition does focus on these processed refined carbohydrates in the context of ultra-processed foods, right? So this is not just any carbohydrate that you use at home. This is not flour, sugar, or starch. It's these products that are used in industrial formulation, right, that are part of these ultra-processed foods. So let me just back up for a second. I see ultra-processed foods as having four key legs of the stool, right? That make up ultra-processed foods. What does the industry basically do to make it ultra-processed foods? They use, it could be refined sweeteners, it's one group. Refined flours and starches, a second group. The third group is, added oils and fat. And the fourth one is salt, right? Salt is not really structural, but clearly drives consumption, right? But you look at what the industry, formulates. It takes its, pots of refined sweeteners, its refined flours and starches, its added oils and fats, and then it takes a whole bunch of other chemicals in order, to make those foods, to give a mouthfeel and texture. Now, the petition doesn't deal with all ultra-processed foods, okay, deliberately. Because the Food and Drug Act just doesn't deal with processing, it deals with ingredients under the condition of use. I deal with really two legs of the stool. So I'm dealing with refined sweeteners and refined flours and starches in the context, right, of this industrial in this context of, these ultra-processed foods. But it bypasses the need to get to a definition of ultra-processed foods, because this petition specifically, the first group, if you're corn syrup, corn solids, glucose syrups, dextrose, invert sugar, xylose, maltose, and high fructose corn syrups, to me, those are not GRAS anymore. I don't think the metabolic, there's not a consensus that those are safe. The second group, right, deals with, flours and starches that are subjected to extrusion technology. Now, extrusion technology, flours and starches, long history, of cooking, subjecting it to temperature, but extrusion technology, really that came around in the 40s and 50s, is a specific type of food technology that exposes these flours and starches, right, to very high shear forces and temperatures, and results in the formula. It really is the molding. Of those flours and starches. It's not the only technology. There's gun puffing. There's other technologies. But what you do when you subject that flours and starches to these high temperatures and high shear forces, you change the structure of the food even more, and no one asked what the effects were on the biological concept, on digestibility. Does it take away satiety, right? The more you destroy that. Now, the third category deals with sucrose, refined flour, and starch when used in combination with emulsifiers, humectants, dough conditioners, stabilizers, gums, or modified starches. So the petition focuses on the markers, if you would, of ultra-processed food, but does not seek to limit sugar, flour, or starch when used at home. And the important thing is the GRAS evaluation deals with ingredients, but under conditions of use. Right? So it doesn't deal with, the act doesn't deal with processing, but if you take an ingredient and you subject it to extrusion technology, that's a condition of use. And you have to evaluate whether it's generally recognized as safe, right? Under that processing. So that's how we get to processing. The other thing that's very important, just to point out, is that the law requires FDA to consider in GRAS evaluation at the current levels of use. So no one could argue this notion, well, food in moderation is not going to cause harm. One can of this or one can of that is not going to cause harm. The fact is you have to evaluate it at doses, and Mike can talk about this, that it's actually being used. And we could see that those doses are leading to 500 extra calories a day.
Yeah. Yeah, and I want to just put a pin there that, the unlike corn syrup or some of the ingredients that are listed in the petition, the extrusion process is not, if I understand correctly, that has not been evaluated in the same kind of systematic way.
Nor on the label.
Yeah.
I mean, well, I think your point, I mean, is a very good one, right? You can see on the ingredient, it'll say flour and starch, modified flour and starch, refined flour and starch, but nowhere does it say what it's been subjected to. And no one studied what the consequences to our bodies, and specifically what the rate of absorption is, what's the effect on insulin, right?
Yeah, and your petition has some really, yeah. If I don't want to misstate it, but I mean the difference in how our bodies digest, something that's been extruded versus
But you understand that the reason that the again, it's not the processed refined carbohydrates are not the be all and end all. We could focus on salt, and the agency has been focused on salt. Mike, to his credit, and the agency focused on that, some of the added oils and fats, right? There's certainly more work to be done. But the act requires you to focus on specific ingredients. You just can't focus on processing. But once you focused on ingredients, you can focus on how they're being processed.
Okay. I want to. I do have some audience questions now, and one kind of dovetails nicely with a question I was going to give you anyway, Mike. Melissa, I think it's Melissa Hollis at non-UPF certification program. She asked if an additive's shown to be harmful, for example, emulsifiers linked to an autoimmune disorder, would that be enough to show it's not in compliance with GRAS? And in conjunction with that, I wanted to ask you, Mike, and David alluded to this a little bit, why are we talking about revoking GRAS status rather than just eliminating the GRAS loophole? And I guess I would say I would assert that it is a loophole in the sense that it allows a food company to evade review of an ingredient. But I've got a quote here from our Health and Human Services Secretary. He says eliminating the GRAS loophole will provide transparency to consumers and help get our nation's food supply back on track by ensuring the ingredients being introduced into foods are safe. Why is that not right? What's wrong with just getting rid of GRAS altogether?
Do you want me to? Let me answer.
And I realized I didn't really. I kind of just asked you two questions. So take those in whatever order.
Very different character, but I'm happy to take a stab at it. I mean, Melissa's question in the chat is framed in terms of an effect seen in an animal study related to autoimmune response. And would that animal study finding by itself show that substance doesn't meet the GRAS standard? And this is a good question because it illustrates what the GRAS standard is about. All by itself, most toxicologists would say that a finding in an animal study doesn't prove causation. We use these studies, though, because we think these animal models give information relevant to human safety. And so we have a process of finding effects and then determining whether there's a safe level of exposure given that. The point, though, that I think is relevant to this discussion is that finding an effect. I mean, if toxicologists say, yeah, that's a genuine question that's raised by that animal finding, that's enough to say that substance doesn't meet the GRAS standard. If it's a genuine question about safety that's not resolved by some other available evidence, it's not like a Delaney clause thing. You're out, but it raises a question that has to be resolved by science. So, yeah, that's I'm not the toxicologist on the case, but I think that's the framework. The question of reform, that's a big topic. Yeah, I mean, but I think
Mike, can I jump in on that question?
Yeah.
Thomas, one of the goals of the petition was to be able to give, the current administration an ability to act and act now, right? And what I had learned when I was commissioner, you could only do those things, you look for those things that are within your control and your authority, right? Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, but the statute itself references GRAS. Fair?
Yes,
Right.
yes.
So that by definition, eliminating GRAS has to go back to, there's a congressional aspect to this. This petition doesn't rely on Congress, right? I mean, it says today, all you have to do is to declare that certain substances are no longer GRAS, and you have that authority. And this is not this is not as complex as defining what a drug is under the act and what Congress intended, right? This is squarely within the existing authority of FDA, and they can act, right? And they can act today. It's that simple, right? And it could forever remake how we think about foods. Now, look, this started, in my head, in some ways. Some of you might remember, might remember that in 1988, the American Heart Association, the American Lung Association, American Cancer Society submitted a petition to FDA, right, to regulate low tar cigarettes as drugs. It was a little odd because, those were, quote, the safer cigarettes. So why did, they asked to regulate those cigarettes as drug. But what were they doing? They were giving FDA the regulatory hook. It took us several years to reframe that question. Not as low tar cigarettes, or low tar cigarettes a drug, not as tobacco a drug, but whether nicotine was a drug, right? So we reframed that. But in essence, this petition gives the regulatory hook with existing authority, right? That is, I think, exquisitely simple and under the law within FDA's authority, not relying on waiting for Congress.
I want to put a slightly even finer point on the legal issue here, because it's not, strictly speaking, just that the GRAS concept gives FDA authority to act. The way the law is written, if you're not GRAS and you don't have an FDA food additive regulation legalizing your use, that use is illegal without FDA taking any action. Now, if the industry doesn't act based upon the statutory illegality of the ingredient, then FDA has to go in and invoke its enforcement authorities. But at that stage, yeah, it would have to make its case that it's, if we get the court to issue an order, it would have to make a showing that the substance is not GRAS. But it's, I just think it's important to bear in mind, particularly if you're an industry, person, that the law is strict here. And again, FDA has not, and FDA has when it has deemed substances not to be GRAS, industry complies. The question is, what is industry's responsibility when it can tell for itself, that these substances or these uses are not GRAS, that they are adding up to a public health concern. So it may sound a little philosophical, but I just think it's part of the context here. The question is, what is the responsibility of an industry that is well aware of the changing dietary patterns? They've been part of changing those dietary patterns, and there's now all this evidence that at least raises a substantial safety question. What is the industry's responsibility? I think that's a germane question.
In essence, what I think the petition does, it opens a door that you can't close back, right? If you're, food industry will take this to their food lawyers, and the first question they will ask and say, is he right? Is this stuff GRAS, right? And what's the standard for GRAS? And is there an expert consensus that, these processed refined carbohydrates are GRAS? And I don't think there's a credible answer that would say these things are GRAS. Now, whether this administration decides to do it or the administration after that decides to do it, this basically takes the rug out, of the industry, that was created, for all these industrial formulated foods. Because, you can't, the industry now needs, I think, a solution. I don't think it's going to be as simple as going to Congress these days. because it seems to be relatively bipartisan. Certainly when I testified about FDA a number of months ago, the Rs wanted to talk about more, they wanted to talk about, rather than drugs coming in from China, they wanted to talk about ultra-processed foods. This is very much on their agenda. So I don't think the industry is just going to be able to get an affirmation by statute that says all this stuff, is GRAS and don't worry about it. right? Maybe they could have done that decades ago. I don't think that's the environment. So the question is, the industry needs a solution here, and that solution obviously is going to open broader questions that have to be addressed.
Yeah, and there's some a lot of great questions coming in on the chat. So I want to elevate a couple of those. I mean, one, just getting at the distinction you make in the petition between um, foods that use these ingredients versus purchasing the ingredients individually and using them at home. Maybe you could talk a little. She says if FDA were to proceed with the action of the petition, how would they approach the fact that these ingredients could be individually be purchased in the store and consumers could make, the cake or whatever with corn syrup at home? Yeah, I take it that's not that doesn't give you much trouble, David.
It's the use of these products as industrial formulations. So
Yeah.
again, understand, for example, that third category is the use sucrose, refined flours, and starches when used with humectants, emulsifiers. So it just doesn't go after emulsifiers or humectants. It goes after that use of these, fat, sugar, and salt when used with those emulsifiers. So it's in these industrial formulations.
Yeah.
But again, I hate to be the nitpicking lawyer on the case here, but if there's an ingredient, an emulsifier, or that somebody, I mean, I realize they're not sold in the grocery stores, but the theoretical question is, there's some ingredient that would raise this safety question. It's sold in a bag for you to go incorporate at home. Well, the law answers the question. If the intended use of the substance results in it becoming a component of food, it's a food additive unless it's GRAS. So, what does not become is a whole food like an apple. You buy an apple, you take it home. It doesn't know, I mean, theoretically, you could say an apple pie, makes that a food additive. But these ingredient issues, yeah, I mean, I think, the question is it going to be safe, and so I think, how all that would play out, who.
But the fact is, what happened was through the use of these industrial formulated foods, right? We have, and by putting these industrial formulated foods and making them accessible and available and advertising them and dialing in palatability, right? Right. We've resulted in, on average, all of us eating about 500 more calories a day, and that's enough to have thrown us into metabolic harm. I mean, it's not only excess calories. I mean, there's no doubt that these processed refined carbohydrates themselves, I mean, have an effect on insulin and insulin clearance that we just didn't understand, right? But if you look at liver fat, I mean, there is a direct line between these processed refined carbohydrates and liver fat and their gene expression systems that turn on in response to those carbohydrates. And certainly, when half the American population is pre-diabetic, right? I mean, and the majority of us are insulin resistant. I mean, it's absolutely crazy. I mean, adding these industrially formulated foods, these ultra-processed foods, I mean, into an insulin resistant body, I mean, is just adding fuel to the fire. And that's where such damage is occurring. And we're talking about heart failure and liver failure.
Another just I think a common reaction to reading the petition, it's expressed in one of these questions. Just what would the supermarket look like if FDA were to kind of grant the petition and revoke the GRAS statute, just to embrace everything that's requested here? I mean, I guess that would depend in part on how the food additive petition process shook out afterwards. But are there some particular products that you think are would be particularly difficult to defend, David, or what?
I mean, look, I think that once you open this door, we have to rethink how how the industry is formulating these foods, right? I think you can just go to certain of, go to some of the European countries that, have markedly less ultra processed foods and look at their supermarkets. I mean, and their citizens are thriving. The industry is expert at formulating foods, right? I mean, that's what it grew up to do. Now it has to figure out how to formulate foods that allow us to thrive, right? I mean, it's not done that. And I think, we're gonna, they're gonna be, again, it all depends on what the cumulative dose is and on what the conditions of use are. But the important thing is the industry has the burden to solve that if it wants to sell these products.
Yeah. It's a question about self-certification. I think I know the answer to this, but it could be helpful to kind of elucidate. Carrie says, with the self-certification process, upon receiving questions or concerns from FDA about a particular food additive, can't industry revoke a food additive petition and instead self-certify a substance as GRAS in secret? And I guess with my understanding is that the ingredients you're targeting with this petition are not, the types of things that could just be left off the label. But is there more to it than is that an issue? And
there were specific Federal Register notices in 1988, and I mean in years around that deal specifically with these products. Now, what's interesting is that no one has looked at these products under the conditions of use of extrusion. So that's, that there's been no evaluation of that. And again, what the petition, I think what the petition does, and I've heard this quietly from FDA. FDA thought it had to go, ingredient by ingredient. You understand? And that's the way it was thinking. And it was also thinking in terms of toxicology and the traditional toxicology. Here, for the first time, I think what we're saying to FDA is you need to look at this class of ingredients. It's not all, it doesn't make up all ultra processed foods. Yes, there's fats and oils. Yes, there's salt. But the vast majority of ultra processed foods, or these ultra formulated foods, I mean, are made up of these starches, flours, and sweeteners, and it allows you to look at it as a class. And in fact, the 88 regulation dealt with this as a class.
I suppose that the extrude, there could be some secrecy around, when an extrusion process is being used with a particular ingredient.
But just, Mike, let's say I want to, GRAS self-determination. Does that allow me to say that, hey, my product is generally recognized as safe, but in fact, if the reality is that it's not generally recognized as safe, how does that get resolved?
I mean, FDA has to go. He could write a warning letter and spell out his position of the company, give the company a chance, and then the next legal remedy is to go to court and say this ingredient doesn't meet the generally recognized as safe standard. There are safety questions, and there's no general recognition of safety. Which case a court could force it off the market.
But I think when you're dealing with, these are Fortune 100 companies that we're dealing with, they're not going to want to be dealing at the margins of being able to sell products for whom the regulatory status is uncertain, or they're doing things in secret. They need certainty. And right now, these products are not generally recognized as safe. There is not a consensus, right? Yes, and there still may be a Federal Register notice, but I would argue that that doesn't have much force, because just look around. I mean, it's very clear that the data, the science has changed.
Yeah. I want to mention too that the role of citizen petitions, and there's Jen Caden had a question about sodium benzoate, which I'm not sure if that's in the food supply as under GRAS, or or something else, but as a food additive. But I believe with trans fat, I mean, a lot, and that was sparked by a citizen petition from Center for Science and the Public Interest as well to revoke the GRAS status for so that to take away the GRAS status of an ingredient, there's a role for a citizen petition.
I mean, the citizens petition played a role in tobacco. They played a
Yeah,
role in trans fat. And look, let's face it. I mean, FDA can ignore a citizens petition if it wants, right? I mean, but if it meets it, it also can help prod the agency and move the agency. I mean, I think that and I would urge people to comment on, I mean, on the docket to tell FDA, what people think and what's the best way to get a handle on this. I think also my sense though, and you can tell me, Thomas, and in my, I mean, this administration has specifically said it wants to deal with these substances. I mean, and here's a route, right? I mean, you can argue whether this is a gift to them or it's a challenge to them. I mean, this is a way to, I mean, if you're really serious, here's how to do it. Now, I mean, I have very strong disagreements. I mean, on vaccines, I mean, I could not be, more opposed to what the administration is doing. I mean, on the cuts in biomedical research, but saying that, this is one of the great public health challenges right now, right? And we have an opportunity. I mean, just our healthcare budget, we can't sustain this, right? And then the administration has an opportunity to fix this. And if it's serious about this, it can act, and it can act today.
okay. Well, we're coming up on time, and I want to give you both a chance to tell people who are watching this and want to make the food system healthier and less prone to making people sick, what they can do and give it some parting thoughts before we close out in 3 minutes. Mike, do you want to start us off?
Well, I think first of all, there is room for food additive and GRAS reform, but the first step is to use the tools that they've got to take action to protect consumers. And so, there's a need to strengthen FDA. I mean, FDA has been really damaged and never was adequately funded before that. So I think that's part of it. But I do think that there is this question of, the food industry needing to figure out what its role is when its products and its practices are driving dietary changes with the health consequences that David has outlined in the petition documents. There's a public health impact to what they do. And how do we engage the industry, in defining and having them play a leadership role in meeting that public health responsibility? That may be pie in the sky, but if that doesn't happen, push will come to shove. It should come to shove because of the cost to society of the status quo. So, you'd like to think there could be a way to, find solutions, that deal with the reality of the legal framework and the status of these products and their impact.
David.
Two things. I was heartened after the petition, got submitted. What was, the nutrition community has a way of, I don't know, eating its own. I mean, the disagreements, I mean, the great debates. But I was struck and heartened by the fact, Marion Nessel, Dari Mazafarian, Christopher Gardner, from Kevin Hall to David Ludwig. I mean, everybody said, hey, that makes sense, right? I mean, no matter what side of the debates, we tend to low fat, low carb, low this. What's it? I think everybody can understand that focusing on, if we can just, I mean, come together and understand that, look, this is not going to solve everything, but it's a way of moving forward. It gives a regulatory hook to move forward today without waiting for Congress. The other request is, and I have seen this, right? And that's how the industry approaches this. I mean, there's going to be a tendency to defend, right? Our products are generally recognized as safe, just moderation. We've seen these for 4 decades. Look, in the end of the day, the industry can try that, and I'm sure some will, right? Defend, and attack, but it's time to solve this. We are too sick as a country when it comes to diabetes and cardiovascular disease, right? And we're leading, unfortunately, we're leading the world. I mean, in this metabolic harm. So there's a real opportunity to come together and rethink this. I'm under no illusion that it's going to be done overnight, but I think the goal was to open the door here.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you, Mike. This has been incredibly interesting conversation for me. And thank you to all of our great questions for our audience members and for all of you for attending. If you'd like to see a recording of this, check it out on the CFA website. It should be up soon. And we'll also have a link to David's petition that we encourage you to comment on, and come to the National Food Policy Conference March 3rd and 4th here in DC. Thanks, and everyone have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Thomas.